listening to Mozart, you guys might be processing it very differently than somebody who's trained to play it. If you're listening to it, most people listen with their right hemisphere. They listen to music patterns. If you've played it, you spend all these years trying to fight with this stuff, you process it like language. You process it very differently. And again, this may be one of the things in autism. People, some people have an enormous talent, perfect pitch, but by the time you start listening and understanding music, that doesn't work. They have trouble with that. I had a girl that she was 5 and drew pictures of horses that were just totally unbelievable. Man, you could think it looked like a photograph. It was that much detail. Well, we spent 3 years trying to get her to use language, and once she started using language, that talent disappeared. It's like she couldn't contain them both, and it was really sad to see it because she could talk now, but that gift, talent, was an amazing gift. It's gone. But language is a very unstructured process. It's open-ended. We generate sentences. A guy named Noam Chomsky in the 60s, the generative grammar, the capacity to take 5 words, 10 words, and to make 300 sentences out of it. Now, most of us can't do that, but we have the capacity to do it. And that seems to be effective. So that capacity to take and create new things, new words, new combinations of words. And so this is a really interesting issue, but again, how do you carry on a conversation? How do you pick a topic? If I'm talking about cockroach mouth parts, I got a good conversation. If you're talking about something else, one little 5-year-old found out I was a dinosaur nut too, and it's me and all the 5 years old at the Metropolitan Museum of Natural History in New York City, looking at the dinosaurs. But he came in the first time I saw him. And he looked at me and said, "Well, hello." I said, "How you doing, John?" He said, "Did you know that Tyrannosaurus rex was a late Cretaceous theropod, stood approximately 15 to 20 feet tall, 50 feet long, probably weighed 3 to 6 tons, had teeth 6 inches, and died out at the KT boundary 65 million years ago?" Never said hello. But you knew right away what to talk about with him. And that's how you approached him. And of course, it would drive his mom and dad crazy because everything had to do with dinosaurs. Now, the other thing is motor coordination. Years ago, when they first started describing Asperger's as a mild form of autism, as a form of autism with basically intact language. Now, comprehension and other skills are missing, but predominantly a sort of pragmatics and common sense, and really how to communicate reciprocally and how to solve problems. But what they noticed was that when you look at those kids, that motor coordination, the praxis problems that some of them had were just very interesting. It wasn't that they were paralyzed and could use their arms and legs, but to sequence movements was difficult. And then somebody starts saying, well, let's pay attention to other kind of sequencing things. How do you tie your shoes? How do you write your name? It's fun looking at that logo. I had a 3rd grade teacher that spent a year trying to teach me to make a J. And I think she finally jumped off a bridge because I couldn't do it. But she finally, I think I retired her. But these are the kind of things that if you look at American Sign Language and how that's processed, I mean, you think it's processed as a motor skill. It's processed the same way as it processed language, which make a lot of people think this is where maybe our language evolved, was from sign and signaling and dancing and imitating. And these are all things that seem to be affected by autism. And again, what you also find in people with this motor dyspraxia is sometimes they're really big tempers too, really explosive, low frustration tolerance, because they just can't figure things out. Anybody here left-handed? I remember my poor father trying to teach me to tie a tie, because I'm left-handed. And it just drove him insane. So finally he got mad and stood behind me. I thought he was going to strangle me. And showed me how to tie from the backside. And I could do it then. Like looking at him this way, it was tough to do. And so you really have to find strategies. I'm glad he didn't strangle me, but he probably wished he had from time to time. But these are kind of skills that things just don't seem to connect. And you sometimes see all of these things put in one person. And since there's so many little variables, excuse me, you can expect a certain degree of variability within this syndrome. And like I said, you've seen one autistic person, you've seen one autistic person. And I know as you classroom teachers would probably kill me for saying this, but whenever I hear a teacher say, I know all about autism, my first reaction is, oh, hell. We're going to be in trouble. Because some of us have been doing this for 30 years and still not sure what we're dealing with. And in fact, it reminds me of a story. My son had ADHD and learning disability. And I was at the school, his elementary school, talking to the principal about one of the kids with autism. And she was a friend of mine. And my wife pulls up, walking out of the car in her usual storming wherever she goes. And the teacher looked out the window and said, oh, hell, here she comes again. So then she looked at me and said, uh-oh. But I think these are but he had a kind of learning disability that really, and motor skill abnormality, but he's also left-handed. And so sometimes those two, and lateralization, which hand is dominant, occasionally correlates with, at least with some mixed developmental disorders, because language may also be equally confused. Now, we got a brain, and we got this behavior that we call autism. It's an observational diagnosis. It's based on what we see. It's based on behavior, what we can measure. What we can't see, what goes on inside the brain. Till recently. And I think what people have been noticing, some really fascinating things that are happening. First of all, it's this very highly inherited disorder. 8 out of 10, or 80% of the variants, which is what degree genes contribute. Autism is about an 80% heritability factor. So, but there are different kinds of autism. There's one kind that may literally run in families. And it looks like the genes that are shared. In milder forms, this thing called the broader behavioral phenotype, that some parents have traits. And we used to joke that if you looked at the population of autism in Southern California, Silicon Valley, 40% of the parents of people with autism are research scientists. And then you meet some of these guys, and you kind of understand what, and they're not clinically autistic, but they're just odd people. They function. They're interested in some strange stuff, and they're very ritualistic. And so this may be a marker for some of these families that have more than one autistic child, one child with autism. I've got families with 4. And they're really interesting. I've never met the father of one of them. He's kind of like a shadow. And he may be the expanded phenotype guy, because mom's a very personable person, but worn out. But again, that's one. And language is lateralized in most of us. It may not be in some people with developmental disabilities. You may see people with traumatic brain injury, especially early in infancy. They can look awfully peculiar, odd, lack some of these skills, be very concrete. They recover quickly. And then others, you wouldn't know anything even happened to them until you get them in high school and try to teach them more abstract thought. And that may be the only time you'd notice it. A lot of people with autism have epilepsy. In fact, about a third. And if you look at that genetic group, the rates are lower. The EEG abnormalities are higher. If you look at the other group that have other neurological and metabolic genetic disorders, they're much higher. And a lot of this is what we see in autism. We have to really begin to distinguish it from intellectual disability, because that's a key variable in determining outcome, actual capacity for the individual to function. And some of the repetitive restrictive behaviors may be related more to intelligence and adaptability from intellectual disability than pure autism itself. And then, of course, what are the risk factors for psychiatric illness? So anybody who has a child with autism, I used to tell parents, puberty never does anything nice to people with autism. The monumental hormonal shifts, the brain is also doing another reorganization job. And that's one of the few populations, autism is one of the few populations that seizures will start to appear in adolescence without an injury of some sort. So it's a second peak. And many of these seizure disorders are hard to control. And then you got to decide, well, what's epilepsy, what's trying to treat the epilepsy from autism. And they can get the same psychiatric disorders all of us do. and we really don't recognize them very well. Give you an example. You guys got a guy in your classroom who episodically just goes completely bonkers. Fearful, frightened, has to get out of the room no matter what. You get in his way, you allow him to get hit, knocked down, he's going to get out of there. So you bring the good behaviorist in, well, that's an escape behavior. Well, it is, he's escaping. But it's also a panic attack. And you see the same reaction cooped up in cars, occasionally sit in elevators. And it really, rather than fear, sometimes it's rage. And a lot of people with panic disorder, that's what they have. Of course, people have been traumatized to have the same kind of problem. And the other thing we get, and I'll talk about that at the end, is we get a lot of people on medication. We just call it better living through chemistry. And psychiatrists, you have to kind of watch. You guys are sneaky. If one drug works, why not try 3? Or if a little bit works, give a lot. Without really knowing what these drugs are actually doing. We're still not sure if they're working the way they would in everybody else. As many people take extremely low doses and get side effects at dose ranges that don't make any sense pharmacologically. Now, what are common problems of preschoolers with autism? Well, aggression. And aggression is pretty common in little kids. They learn to deal with it otherwise. And males are much more likely to engage in physical aggression than girls. Girls are sneaky. If you start averaging in the amount of ostracism and clicking and keeping people away and consider that aggression, that thing pretty much balances out. But a lot of these kids also have impulse control disorders, they're hyperactive, they've been physically abused, you got all these things playing into them. But remember, aggression is a symptom. And when you tell me John is aggressive, that tells me absolutely nothing. If you say he's aggressive 3 times a month, that tells me nothing. Doesn't tell me anything about that aggression. So if you want to refer somebody, be able to describe what you have seen, be able to look at what preceded it if you can find it, and what happens, and the function if you can figure it out, because this is probably the best way of collecting information. And so what I do is I start looking at the neurophysiology of what you're describing, and that's where we start looking at drugs in terms of how that person reacts, not just what he does. Because there's 7 or 8 different types of aggression. And each can be very, very different. If I wait for you to come out of this building and ambush you because you ticked me off a couple of days ago, that's very different if I just explode and attack you, because I think you're going to kill me. But we all call it the same thing. And folks with autism have a wide range of triggers for aggression. And most of the time, I don't know if it's in Louisiana, but if you're aggressive in the classroom or you're aggressive at home, a lot of people's behavior treatment plans just call the cops. Take them to the ER. And man, I tell you, watching some of my folks have been taken to the ER, it's a little bit like landing on another planet. I mean, they're just terrified of that place. It's crazy. It's bad enough you go in and you got all your faculties. It's because so much noise, so many things they're not familiar with, people poking on you and not telling you why they're poking on you. And so it's really kind of a chaotic experience. So the idea is try to keep them out of there as much as you can. Oppositional behavior. I'm sure y'all have never seen this. But it's a very complicated problem. And right now, there was an article in the American Academy of Child Psychiatry last year looking at, well, what about the subtypes? The 2 major symptoms for oppositional behavior. One is you got folks that are just plain irritable, nasty, and high neuroticism, if you want a term. And then you got another group just flat out defiant. You ain't gonna tell me what to do no matter what. Well, somebody got the bright idea, well, let's look at the outcome of some of these kids, because people have been doing this work for decades. What they noticed is the kids that were irritable and negativistic had higher rates of depression, clinical depression. If you added the incapacity to experience pleasure, which some of these kids do have, it just goes through the roof. And people with autism are hard to figure that out. They don't interested in things they used to be interested in. It's about all you can go by. They don't enjoy stuff like they used to. But the other bunch, the openly defiant, higher rates of ADHD, and higher rates of conduct disorder, more the progression toward more what I call externalizing or disruptive behavior disorders. And again, this is the same thing that happens with people with autism. They share this. And I don't know, in Louisiana, if it's as bad as in North Carolina, but behind every tree, at least three borderline bipolar kids. And somebody looks funny, has a temper tantrum, and throws a fit, they're bipolar. Well, they're not. It's a relatively rare syndrome if you diagnose it. And of course, for you guys, oppositional behavior just drives you insane. And sometimes the behavior programs don't always help much because kids are oppositional to those too. And you say, well, why don't you change the reinforcement? Give them something they really want. Well, then they won't like that. It's really difficult. That Defiant Child, the book was written about 20 years ago, still an awfully good book to look at. You really kind of get that oppositional behavior can be an attachment behavior too. It's a way of keeping you in contact, just like echolalia. We used to try to get rid of that in people with autism. Turns out that's a profound way of interacting with people. You're interacting. You're talking about cockroach mouth parts, that's a way of interacting. You're not taking into account what the other person might be interested in, but you're still communicating. And bullying and abuse, I think we probably underdiagnosed this. And again, there's a push in England a few years back looking at people with Asperger's, not as Mozart or Thomas Jefferson, which a lot of people would disagree with that, but as all axe murderers. And at a forensic unit, they noticed there were higher numbers of people with Asperger's syndrome in it. And then you start looking at the histories. Most of these guys have been abused, and most of them was an explosive, violent act. It wasn't a premeditated act. And so it may not have anything to do with Asperger's at all. It's maybe these guys were victimized. And then, of course, PTSD is prominent, but I'm not sure we know how to recognize it. And I think a lot of these kids that are aggressive may have this as a disorder. Now, I'm going to reiterate this stuff since I got an official timekeeper down here who's sending me all these nasty messages. That's exactly what is social communication. You know, if you watch what everybody was doing before we came in here, that's what it is. You're sitting here being quiet like you're supposed to. Nobody's thrown any tomatoes yet. I mean, that's good. That's social communication. But I think if you watch folks with autism, it really, especially as adolescents, that just drives them insane. They just idle chit-chat's a total waste of time. Give me the facts. Let me know what I need to do. Don't give me all this crap. Because they can't really figure it out. And the bug man I was telling you about, what he did, he would sit in interaction with one person and say something, do something, and get them to react and store that. And he said, the only time I get into trouble, I can do that with one person. But if there are 3 or 4, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it fast enough. And we just intuit this. It just happens. We don't even think about this. We walk in a room and size up, well, this is a tough crowd. Tell a few bad jokes and people get up and leave. That's a tough crowd. But you have to intuit that. Nobody holds up a sign except 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And then the restrictive behaviors are so common. For many people, life is a ritual. Turning on the wrong street violates a ritual. Not having green eggs and ham or whatever is a violation of a ritual. And so a lot of aggression and disruptive behaviors come when something occurs unexpectedly. It's outside the realm of predictability to that person. So you've challenged a very ritualized way of viewing the world as predictable. And I think we can begin recognizing some of this stuff, but some of it's very subtle. And in preschoolers, you may just see the kid does the same thing over and over and over again. Same interest. A lot of these guys get labeled obsessive-compulsive disorder. They're not, if you look at them very carefully. I have a fair number of kids that have autism, Tourette's disorder, and some compulsive ritualistic behaviors. And they can mix and match. You can't tell where one stops and the other one begins sometimes. But the earlier we can recognize this syndrome and to take all that stuff we talked about, the more likely we are to have some success. Now, many people will still probably be autistic, will have autism, but they can move up several layers of social function. And the idea in all of this is social function. And I think this is where some of the very early intervention programs have been most successful. Now, in a classroom, most of you guys, if you don't do the, my wife used to laugh. She had kids that precisely at 10 o'clock, and I don't know how these kids could tell time, that was time to be in reading circle. and they couldn't read, but they would sit in a reading circle. And if you didn't do that, you paid for it. They would get very upset and start ranting and raving, doing something. So you really learn to, and what we need to learn how to do is how do we adapt an environment to them rather than them having to adapt to what we think is right. And that's an impossible thing to do, but I think you'd be much more successful changing the content, rather than playing with contingencies, reinforcing behavior, is actually look at what triggers it. Let's look at the change. Can we modify that? Can we have a verbal prompts? Can we have a visual schedule? All the things that teachers done, the things that the Denver modified program, they do this. They put this stuff into a very sequence, and you follow your checklist. I got people as adults bring in that checklist, and they got a picture of me that probably looks about as bad as the one in the brochure. And one guy had a jackass, and that was me. But kind of social commentary, I guess. But yeah, the other thing is, if you think you recognize that this doesn't make sense, because this is what this disorder feels like. It just doesn't make sense. And know your referral sources. And I don't know what they are in Louisiana, but in North Carolina, they're getting scarce. And they're cutting funding back right and left in North Carolina for everybody. Preschool education, we had a More at 4 program, cut the funds. So we were talking that might as well kind of open up the prison cell for a lot of these kids because they're not going to make it. It's the ones my wife teaches. And educational interventions can be effective, but they take an awful lot of time. And like, if you look at applied behavioral analysis, you're talking about 30 or 40 hours a week for 2 years, and you're not going to do that in the classroom. But you can do some things. You can find out what the kids' interests are and work those out. Another thing, a lot of times you're called on to monitor where a treatment works. That's always fun. Is this drug working? Well, they hadn't killed me today, so I guess it is. Without oftentimes not really specifying what you need to monitor. And half the time, you may be the only person who recognizes a side effect, because the family may not. And this is the last myth. There's a magic bullet out there. We don't have anything yet that treats autism. We've got some things that may alter how genes are expressed, but there are 300 genes and 500 proteins that are different in brains of autism and so-called, quote, neurotypical folks. Which one? Pick one. The ones related to Fragile X may be the most interesting. Some of them related to Rett syndrome are also. But drugs don't teach, they don't explain, they don't deal with a conflict, they don't deal with a social issue, they just zap you. That's what I do for a living, I zap people. But you really have to be careful because they really interfere with learning. And it's not what you want now. And more medication or other medication is not a good strategy. So, I think you guys can read these better than I can since I'm running out of time. But two things I want you to remember. One, you've seen one child with autism, you've seen one child with autism. And the second is psychotropic drugs are poisons with positive side effects. Because that's exactly what they are. Sometimes they're essential. But you got to remember those things have profound impact on learning and behavior, and they're not benign agents. It's not like giving somebody an aspirin and many of them have some fairly severe side effects. They use them judiciously and try to use them in a common sense fashion. And we try to follow the same model that you treat folks with epilepsy. You try to keep it one drug, you have to start the second one because the first one didn't work, you build it up and get rid of the first one. But that doesn't happen often. And we don't have any good measures other than what people observe is what these drugs are actually doing. So, I'll shut up and let, you got a minute, son? we got 1 minute, okay. Thank you. You know, I think a lot of parents see this early and don't know what it is. And I think the biggest thing is the lack of social interest or social relatedness or engaging in parents in reciprocal interaction. What's interesting is if I look and point to the right to the picture, naturally people's eyes will follow that. A lot of people with autism don't do that, or they don't smile, or they don't focus on your face, and they don't respond to language. So a lot of people think they're deaf when they're very small children. So that's probably the earliest symptoms. And language usually begins showing up about 2, really delays in language. And the other stuff, the repetitive stuff, may show up later.
What are the current trends in treatment, and what kind of encouraging signs have you seen?
Well, I think the early interventions have really been promising. Applied behavioral analysis, or what's called discrete trial learning, is one technique. It does really well at initiating social interaction, initiating language, but I think it really probably is not a cure. And what folks now are really trying to understand is what are the genes that switch on that get this disorder started, and can we interfere with those or change those? And I think that's where the future is going to be.
The more awareness we have in our community, the more people that know, not just in the education community itself, teachers and academia, but just everyone. The more we know about this, the more we can help, because the sooner we can identify kids with challenges or maybe have some issues and help them work through that, the more success they'll have when they're later.
A very interesting discussion on a particular topic that's of interest to a lot of folks, and clearly a group of people that have a tremendous amount of potential but need a little bit of special attention.
I would like for them to keep in mind the great opportunity that they had in coming here and hearing from a world-class presenter who speaks all over the world. He just got back from Austria just a couple days ago. And that in hearing from these experts that they can use this information right where they are, whether they're a classroom teacher, an administrator, a private company that's looking for ways to invest in early childhood education, as well as nonprofits and the work that they do. So these sessions are free community education designed to give the latest information from research and other practices, so that the ones who attend can have this information and use it, take it back to wherever they work, and contribute in this community and use it in order to improve educational outcomes for children.
If people have questions like more information, what should they do?
Well, we have a number of ways for people to stay in touch with us, from our website, which is www.adfbr.org, www.adfbr.org. Also, our new number, for those who have followed us for the last 2 years, is 225-293-3345, 225-293-3345. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook. Our website has a wealth of information about who we are, what we do, our speakers, and other programs that ADF offers to our communities.